Today we have a guest who, in my opinion, has the coolest name. It's like a vampire hunter type name, Chase Maddox. And if you haven't heard of him, you may know his very popular Instagram page, Jazz Memes. And even if you are not fluent in jazz playing, if you've studied any bit of jazz whatsoever or been to a jazz show, you will definitely get the joke. So you want to subscribe to him there and also on his YouTube channel under his name, Chase Maddox. And so we're going to talk a little bit about learning guitar, teaching guitar, struggles, triumphs, all of that stuff. And I promise at the end, we are going to have a very interesting gear discussion because Chase, well, would it be fair to call you a minimalist in your guitar rig?
I think so. I think so.
Yeah. So we'll get to that
Yeah.
much later. But so Chase, tell us how you found your way to jazz guitar.
Just to give you some context, my brother and sister are also musicians, so it's a kind of a family endeavor. My brother, who also co-founded JazzMemes with me, older brother, he plays piano, and then my younger sister is a drummer. So the three of us have a jazz trio, and our parents were always supportive of that when we were young. So I started off on piano and then moved to guitar when I was around 13, and pretty much immediately wanted to go into jazz guitar. My dad took us to a lot of jazz concerts, and that was always kind of the genre that was interesting to me. So I kind of jumped right to that instead of what I think a lot of guys go through, where they're exposed to like blues and rock and then get introduced into jazz and introduced into that. I was really kind of weird in that I started with jazz and then had to almost go backwards to get some of the blues language back into it, because I was always interested in like the theory aspect of it and a lot of the advanced nature of understanding the harmony and improvisation, where the blues type of guitar at first, to me, like when I was younger, seemed like, okay, cool, I get it, I get these pentatonics. I didn't understand the nuances of it, but I thought I understood it at that level, so I wanted to move on to jazz.
Yeah, that's pretty much the exact same thing with me. Like I started with blues and rock, but after I learned the pentatonic scale and I could play two licks, I was like, oh, I get this. What's the next level of being able to improvise? And that brought me
Yeah,
to jazz.
yeah.
So quick question on that journey. Since you started with piano, when you came to guitar, so when I was in school, we were forced to play and learn piano for like
Mhm.
4 semesters. And for all the
Okay.
guitarists, it's always like, this is so crazy hard because you can't just slide your hand up and get the same chord.
Yeah, yeah.
When you went from piano to guitar, did you have the reverse where it seemed easier as an instrument?
Yes, it definitely seemed easier. And there was a huge advantage for me. So I played both instruments for a while, and I can still play piano, although I haven't really focused on it for a long time, especially since my brother's a pianist. So he handles that. But yeah, going from piano, I attribute it to the fact that you have treble and bass clef at the same time. That visualization and kind of splitting your hands that way, going to one staff, first of all, it made me a much better reader. Like
Hmm.
reading notes on guitar I never, related to those memes of guitars not being able to read, because I was like, I can read better than any of these guitars because it's easy piano. It's not two hands, it's just a one staff. How that's not difficult in that coming from piano. Um, so yeah, it was a much easier transition, I think, than doing it the other way around. Like, are you talking about like the like jazz piano in college, like going through
Yeah.
those like kind of
Well,
beginner? Yeah.
well, I did a music education degree that was just
Okay.
general music education. So we had to just learn how to play piano,
Like
whatever that
class piano.
means.
Yeah, the class piano they
Classical.
called it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So when you switched to guitar, was that more of a deep musical guitar passion, or was it more like, well, my brother plays piano, I might as well round out the band a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it was basically this. So all three of us, my brother and sister, we're very close in age. Like we're within a year either way of me. So we all were playing piano, and then we were tired of classical piano, like you would be as a teen, like trying to learn like Clementi and Mozart, and you're just like, this is not cool at all. So we all wanted to do a different instrument. My brother did saxophone. I wanted to do guitar because my dad was a guitarist. He had guitars around. And so I was like, okay, I'll do that. Um, he did guitar like in up through high school. He was doing jazz guitar. And then my sister originally did voice, but it was kind of a weird age where voice wasn't like the greatest for her. So she switched to drums to kind of fill out the band, because we had me or my brother could be on piano, he could be on sax, I could be on guitar, and then we needed a drummer, we thought. So that ended up being like our path. And then my brother did saxophone a little bit in college and then switched back to piano like as his main focus. And I basically, once I left piano, I stayed with guitar. Like it was definitely more like I connected more to guitar and seeing how it applied. And I also like the variety of genres that you could do. It seemed like any genre really could apply with guitar, with the exception of classical. I wasn't really into classical. I like listening to classical music, but like classical guitar, for example, is not a style I've touched at all. It's not one that really interests me, but every other style that I was into, I was like, oh, cool, this has guitar. And it usually has prominent guitar, or there's like some well-known guitars in that genre.
Yeah, for those who have not tried classical guitar yet, who the listeners, it's a completely different everything. Like the pedagogy is different. The things that they focus on is completely different. It's just it's not like playing acoustic guitar and playing art shop and playing electric guitar. Nylon guitar is like a totally different monster. Repertoire, everything, styles. That's really interesting. So you eventually went to school for music, right?
I did. I studied jazz guitar at University of North Florida with Barry Green.
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, for those who don't know, Barry Green is a amazing jazz guitarist, and he also has a website where he has his own courses and whatnot, as does Chase.
He does.
And yeah, it's just great because there aren't a lot of jazz guitarists who have a very thorough website where you can learn the information. But Chase is one, Barry's another, Tim Miller maybe the only other person who's famous and also has a website. Anyway, that's really cool. I did my master's in what is it, Florida State University. So I was in Florida for exactly 19 or 20 months of my life. So that was interesting. Did you?
Especially Tallahassee.
Yeah. Tallahassee is like not even really Florida because it's landlocked. It's humid. You don't get any of the benefits of being in Florida, and yet you're in Florida.
Yeah. I had considered FSU, but they don't really have a jazz guitar teacher. So you get like some of the other jazz professors are great. But like Marcus Roberts and Scotty Barnhart. But without a jazz guitar teacher, Barry Green was an easy choice.
Absolutely. I was actually trying to choose between Rutgers and Montclair State. And I don't know if you know, but Rutgers had Rick Juris there for a long time. Yeah, who's another amazing jazz guitarist. But Montclair was the better choice for financial reasons. But,
you say Rick Juris?
Yeah.
Oh, so he and Barry are actually like, they were longtime friends because they were both New Jersey guys.
Exactly.
Vic might have even taught Barry. I think he did, because they lived very close to each other in New Jersey at one point.
I didn't know that. I knew they knew each other. I didn't know that they were that close. I'm also
they were pretty close. Okay.
Nice.
Yeah.
So what was your time like in university? How did you feel about it?
It was good. I liked it a lot. I mean, there's always, so first of all, having Barry was great. Especially, I was considering UM and some different schools, but beyond the cost, what I liked about Barry is you get at UNF, and it's not the same with a lot of these schools. I got Barry for 4 years. I got to study with him for 4 years, as opposed to having different TAs, different semesters, and then maybe you get the main professor, maybe you don't even, depending on how many people are in. So it was a very small, guitar studio. We all knew each other really well. And studying with Barry was great. The rest of the teachers, like everything about it, I think was really positive. Especially I had my brother and sister also went to UNF. Like we kind of all were there. My brother was there first, then me, and then my sister. All the other teachers there are great. Lynn Ariel on jazz piano, Danny Gottlieb on drums, one of the original Pat Metheny drummers. And you get to study with all of these guys in different combos in the big bands. Everyone's pretty easy to reach. So yeah, my highlight was always studying with Barry. That was like the main thing I was there for. Um, but it also brought in a lot of great musicians because of all the other teachers. And so your peers were also great. As far as some of the education goes, it wasn't really until thinking back on it later where I was realizing, oh, some of this would be different from how I would have liked to study it, where I probably would have benefited from more structure to how the classes were in certain areas. Like, say in the arranging, that was great. Like that, there was a certain structure to what we do, and we would arrange big band charts. But sometimes in the improvisation classes, now I was lucky again because I had Barry as a personal teacher, so it wasn't like I missed out on any of this. But other instrumentalists I know did, where they only had that one class. It was very much taught like most of the academic college improv courses are, where it's very like scale based and not as vocabulary based. And I didn't really think anything of it at the time because, you know, when you're in it, you're not really seeing with that outside perspective. And there's so much other stuff going on that you're busy with, that you're not really thinking, is this the best way I could be learning this? Currently, you're like, you have a ton of stuff you need to work on, a ton of concerts you need to work towards. But that's the part that, in thinking back on it, and that's what I'm trying to develop now, is having more of a curriculum to learning jazz guitar, where there's less time in this, you know, plateau area, or where at least each step or it's laid out, what should I learn next and why. You know, my big issue with it is you'll go from like one song that has all of this, all of these certain chord scales or types of progressions, and then you jump to another one that none of those things you just practiced really relate to what you just did. There's no like carryover, even in key. So like the songs were like, oh, well, let's learn Autumn Leaves, and then we'll learn Cell by Starlight, and then we'll learn this. And there's so much to each of those songs that if you don't, in my opinion, come to it with a broader base of knowledge, like first do this song, then do this song, then do this song, and then you can get into Stella, or then you can get Autumn Leaves. You just end up doing like little quick fixes and don't really like delve into that song. So overall, I'd say my experience was great. And then it's just, you know, recently in the last few years that I've been trying to think about ways of doing that better, really incorporating more vocabulary, learning more from recordings, and how to turn that into a curriculum instead of just like going to that like academic scale-based learning.
And you were a jazz studies major? Is that what they?
Yeah, I was a jazz. Yeah, jazz studies.
Yeah,
Jazz studies. I think it says guitar performance, but yeah, jazz studies.
Yeah. So for those listening, there are a few major degree options you have in most universities in the US. You have music education, you have jazz studies, a few schools have music therapy, and then you have performance. And usually if it just says performance, it means classical performance and not jazz studies. At least at my university, Montclair State University, where I did my undergraduate degree, jazz studies was almost like a completely different department outside of the music department. It's not like that everywhere, but that was the case there. And so depending on what university you choose to go to, you're going to have a dramatically, and what degree you choose, you're going to have a dramatically different experience. Case in point, although I studied jazz guitar as my primary instrument, I was a music education major. So everything that I studied had nothing to do with jazz guitar. And my private lessons once a week was my only jazz guitar education, so to speak, or jazz education, so to speak. And so in all of my classes, they're teaching me, you know, how to read piano and how to transpose for big bands and for none of the things that I would actually care about doing, but all the things you would need to do if you wanted to teach K through 12 music education in, you know, a public school, for example. And so if you're at a point right now in your life where you're thinking about what you want to do or what degree you should pick, you really have to consider what your career is going to be. And if your career is going to be a performer, especially in jazz studies is what you should do. And you may not get so much out of it if you think I'm just going to take private lessons in jazz while doing a different degree, you know? So now that you finished your degree, you've been teaching and performing and composing for a substantial period of time. Now you have several students. Is that the main issue that you find with your students, what you just kind of described, of how you learn all of these songs, which are kind of pieces of the puzzle to understanding jazz, but there's no real clear idea of how it all fits together until you learn it all, and then you put it together at the end?
Yeah, so actually, let me even back up. So when I came out of college, I was teaching at a local music store. It is actually the store that I used to take lessons from when I was a kid, in South Florida. And so I taught there for a while, and there were a few things about it. I taught there maybe a few years. One aspect was having to reteach the same lesson, right? Like I realized that for my own time as a musician, I was like, I'm spending a lot of time teaching the same lesson over and over. And that was kind of frustrating for me, like that kind of repetition, especially as a musician and a jazz musician. We thrive on that novelty of each time it can be a little bit new and varying. And then, yeah, like you're saying, I noticed that, most of the other teachers would just, the student comes in, it's like, hey, what song do you want to learn? You learn that, but there wasn't any like structure to it. And it was tough to do in that way anyways, because some of these students were only there for like, a month, 6 weeks, and then their parent quits. And so you can't really do that. You're trying to just get the student engaged, especially when they're younger, right? So I did that for a long time, and we were doing JazzMemes related stuff. And only recently I really started to think about and develop, probably in the last couple of years, like basically around the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And it really came to me once the pandemic hit. Even being in Florida, there were no gigs, like really none for a decent period of time. I think I had one on Sundays that was outdoor that this guy still did despite any criticism he was getting. And so I ended up taking a job as a calculus teacher for a year, because math's always been another passion of mine.
Wait, pause.
So,
One second. Was this like a teacher in like a school, or like a
yeah.
tutor?
So no, I was a teacher. I had always tutored math on the side just to kind of keep up that skill. But coming out of high school, I was either going to go into biomedical engineering or jazz guitar. Like I was very good in academics, and math and science was a big interest of mine, still is. But decided to go the jazz guitar route. And so this opportunity came up where they needed, in the pandemic, a lot of older teachers were worried about being in a school situation. So one of my old math teachers contacted me and said, hey, I'm retiring. We can't find anyone who can teach calculus. We're so desperate that we're literally asking you, who's a musician, to teach calculus. And, I have a degree in Florida. You don't actually need the math background, although I had done it before. I taught math in high school before coming out of college. Mm-hmm. So I had experience with it. And I had to go through a few, tests to make sure that I knew what I'm talking about. Like they tested me and stuff. But in doing that, teaching calculus for this whole year at a high school, I was thinking like there isn't, math has a certain curriculum. You don't just jump to calculus. You first learn arithmetic, and you go to algebra, and maybe even geometry, algebra 2, trig, and also these concepts come back. So like when you're going to pre-calc, you are learning and relearning algebra concepts, algebra 2 concepts. And then all of that's needed to get to calculus. But there was nothing like that in, even the music setting, but let alone jazz guitar, where there's a progression, and it's a kind of an established progression. No one tries to teach you calculus before you know algebra. It just doesn't make any sense. But we kind of do that in the jazz guitar realm, at least. I won't speak for other genres that I don't know as well, where you're trying to learn advanced songs before you've really worked those fundamentals or other songs that kind of lead into them. So I spent a lot of time going through, I went through like 100 jazz standards. I did this manually because I don't know enough about computer programming, of listing out the various chords and keys. And I had a method of going through it to see what is the path that we can learn 50 to 100 jazz standards while also trying to minimize the new information. So if you learn a new song, hopefully it's just one new progression you need to learn, not like the whole song is new. Right. And look, there's so many jazz standards. It's like, I was like, there's got to be a better way of organizing this. So you're not jumping from, I have to learn these 32 new chords and progression and how they all connect and improvise. And then I go to another song and it's in a totally different key everything's a different type of progression. I've never even seen this chord type before. Like, I think that's what's really overwhelming for people, because even if both of those songs are well-known jazz standards, in my opinion, there should be a better path to get there, to learn through this. So basically that's what I found. It's totally possible for 50 to 100 jazz standards. I have a whole list. And the 50 is free on the JazzMemes blog, just jazzmemes.org. There's a blog post about it. The order that I would do those, it's basically starting from blues-based songs and then moving from there and moving through certain keys, so that each time there was never more than 3 new chords. And sometimes it's even less. Obviously, you start with the blues, so there's 3 chords right there if you do a very basic blues. And the reason I do it based on harmony is as one kind of initial thing. If there's a certain types of chords, it tends to mean that it's in a same key, and everything else, the progressions are generally within that key. They're not jumping around. There's a few exceptions, like Giant Steps technically has fewer chords. It could be placed earlier, but for obvious reasons with the whole concept of it and the speed that you normally play it, that goes later. That's much later in my progression. So I take that into account as well, but that's basically what I'm basing my whole curriculum and what I'm teaching in my jazz guitar community now is based off of that, trying to go through. And it's had good success. These adult students feel like they're really learning in a way that they weren't getting either by just jumping on YouTube or by just jumping from, known standard to another known standard.
Absolutely. And I talk about this in detail. I have a series where I forget what the name of the series is, but it's something like All YouTube Teachers Suck, like parts 1 through 3. Salacious name. I don't really mean that. The whole idea is that if you're trying to learn guitar on YouTube, forget about if it's something as advanced as jazz theoretically. If you're trying to learn something on YouTube and you're just trying to grab a piece of stuff randomly, you're never going to figure out how it all fits together in an efficient way.
Yeah.
You need a structure and you need to have scaffolding to connect these different ideas. In your case, you're talking about connecting these different songs in a way that gets more complex as you add different types of chords to it. As you add different types of chords, you need to learn how to improvise with them differently, so on and so forth. I'm sure you go into all of that detail. But what I really like in what you just said, and also the reason why I asked you to be my first guest, is because even just going on your YouTube channel and looking at your random videos, like for those of you who've never watched his videos, look up his Scarpeggio video. Scarpeggio. It's this concept where you're mixing scales and arpeggios in an ascending and descending way. Watch the video. But the point being is, when Chase teaches, it's very clear that he's considering where his concept is fitting into the whole of guitar playing. And I think that's what a lot of guitar teachers miss. And it's also a lot of what students don't have the ability to do yet, because they're still in such an early phase. And it's super important to, as soon as possible, start to develop your ability to see things that you're learning in a related way to each other. So I think it's really cool that you address that. Change of topic. I forgot to ask you this. How did you come up with you and your family come up with the JazzMemes thing? What's the origin story of that?
So it basically comes down to when my brother and I were in college at UNF. This is like when, I'm trying to place it in time. It was like basically between like 2011 and 2014. That's like when I was there with my brother at UNF. And memes were like starting to become like popular as like the thing, at least in the jazz, in our, music college. But we didn't see people doing it in like related to jazz, like, because that's such a niche thing. So we basically had the idea like of doing, and first we did it anonymously. Like, we were anonymous for many years, actually, like 3 or 4 years. So that kind of helped with the mystery of it. No one knew who JazzMemes was. Literally, even now, sometimes I got a message from an old college buddy who's like, I had no idea you were JazzMemes. I'm like, we've been known for a while, but just from being there and being in certain gig situations, that's really how it started. We'd be in certain gig situations, and someone vibes you on the gig, or the singer like does something annoying on the gig, on the jazz gig, and we wanted ways, like we'd always relate to each other, like as musicians, we'd be, you know, like musicians love like talking behind people's backs and like just talking about gig situations. And so we would turn those into memes and then post them anonymously on this jazz memes thing based on something that just happened to us on the gig. And a lot of times it would relate to someone specifically, but we didn't want to tell them specifically, like tell them exactly what. So we would just post this and everyone would relate to it. Our own like college started following it. And then like everyone within the college started following it and beyond. And it was hard to pinpoint because there's a lot of Florida people. It was like a lot of UM guys, and then a lot of UNF guys. People didn't know where the origin was. And one other thing that really helped us with that in growing it was that we kind of recognized early is we picked a lot of, you know, either well-known jazz musicians or current jazz musicians that would be interested and kind of like to like have a meme done of them, because then they would share it and post it and it was like, oh look, cool, I got recognized. And so they're like, oh, I got jazz memes. And for a while that was like a thing. Like people would, when we didn't have that many people, it'd be like people would wait to get jazz meme. They'd feel like special in some way that they got a meme made of them. So that's kind of how it started. Just like as a college thing, we were just making these, you know, whenever we were on a gig and had some idea, or would save up like some ideas and then post them.
Very cool. Very cool. I would run into them not on Instagram because I just started using Instagram only of 2019 maybe. I was very late to Instagram. But I would run into them like just on Google Images, and I would find them really interesting. You know, people screenshot and post and, you know, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So what are some of the guitarists that have inspired you most in like trying to create your own style?
Yeah, I mean, I have to give credit again to Barry, because pre-Barry, I was not a very good guitarist. The thing that Barry saw in me is that I had a decent time feel and could learn the things, because I took a lesson with him privately before being accepted, just to see if we were a good fit. And he could see that I could learn the theoretical stuff that he wanted to teach me pretty easily. So he thought he could teach me, and I think he did. So he was a massive influence on my actual playing, and listening to him and learning his concepts. Like I apply those all the time. As far as like more known guys, my main influence is George Benson. Guys like George Benson he's definitely my number one. And then also guys like Pat Metheny and Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery. Those are my big guitar influences.
Yeah.
But to me, there's no one better than George Benson, because his combination of like blues and jazz, and also always sounding like George Benson, no matter what genre. Like you can hear him with any type. It could be smooth jazz, straight ahead jazz, blues. He's on a Gorillaz track. He always sounds exactly the same. So he kind of breaks the stereotype of like sounding different in different genres. He just sounds like him, and it's always killing.
Yeah, it's a shame because I feel like if you ask jazz guitarists, do they respect George Benson? Of course, everyone is going to say yes. But I feel like sometimes he's not held in as high regard as he should be because he's jumped through so many genres. And
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes there's a tendency for like, if you're not playing straight ahead jazz, then, you know, you're, you know, not ostracized, but sometimes it's looked down upon, at least in my very, very limited experience in the community. But yeah, his ability, for me, what I really love about George Benson is his ability to mix straight ahead vocabulary with very, very bluesy vocabulary right next to each other, like in the same lick. It's like that was very bebop and that was very bluesy, and it doesn't sound like here's blues, here's bebop. You know, it just sounds like you said, like himself the entire time.
Yeah, and when he hits those blues things, it's like instant stank face. Like once he does that, you're just like, it brings out the emotion like right at the right time, in a way that I feel like other guitarists, it kind of, when I hear other guitarists that don't have that, I kind of feel like it's missing that. Like I always want that. Pat Metheny kind of has his own unique thing. I think in his style, it's like very pretty melodies that I really appreciate. Like some of his, and his virtuosity is insane. But someone like Joe Pass, I don't get that kind of like just raw blues that George Benson will just hit you with at the end of his line.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's a lot of jazz. I don't. I'm always hesitant because when you talk about jazz, it's easy to, if you talk about it the wrong way, it sounds like you're talking down on people. At least when
Mm-hmm.
I talk about things, because I'm very opinionated. So I, of course, respect a lot of the jazz guitarists of today. Obviously, they're all very, very talented. But what I find missing when I'm personally listening is what you said, the stank bass. There's a lot of
Yeah.
just amazing, genius uses of putting this arpeggio and scale over this chord in this amazing way with this perfect technique. But that thing of like, wow, that lick right there was just funky, right? Or
Yeah.
sometimes even the time feel, we don't get as much of a grooving, really heavy swinging time feel as
Mm-hmm.
much sometimes with modern guitarists. I personally miss that a lot, you know. And George Benson has all of that in spades, plus all of the technique, of course.
Yeah, there's like a rawness to him playing. Now he has the technique to pull it off, but even if sometimes it's like a little bit sloppier, you can tell he's just going for it. He's just like going for what he's hearing, and now he nails it most of the time. No question about it. But I feel like there's like almost too much like being careful or like um, focusing too much on like the precision of what you're playing, the line of it. Like it's too clean in what you're playing, not necessarily clean tone, but that it misses out on some of that emotion. It starts to become too much like a classical type of virtuosic performance and less like it's losing the blues element that I think is such a core part of jazz.
100%. Yeah. Well, that's a good transition to this topic because a lot of modern jazz guitarists, again, for those who don't know, play with a tone that is very slightly overdriven.
Mm-hmm.
The cliche modern jazz tone is like very slight overdrive, a bit of reverb, and then like a long-ish delay that kind of trails off. That's just cliche. That's what it is. Of course, that's a beautiful tone, and many guitarists use it
Mm-hmm.
very, very nicely. Jonathan Kreisberg, one of my favorites, his tone
Yep.
is just like that, but it's amazing and perfect. Okay, point being, let's talk about your tone and what you go for, and also some of your gear and your thoughts about using gear. That was a lot to
Yeah.
say at one time.
No, that's fine. I'm kind of smiling because I don't really think about my tone that much, to be honest. My general, signal chain, if you want to call it, is literally my Ibanez Art Core and then plugged into my Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. And that is about it 90% of the time. I do have a pedal board that sometimes I'll use either for like a looper or for I like like having the tuner pedal, the volume pedal, just for some more control depending on the gig. And I do have overdrive, chorus, delay on those. I think it's a full tone, full drive for the overdrive, and then it's an analog man delay, dual delay, and an analog man chorus. And that's generally what I have on the pedal board. But most of the time, it's just my Ibanez into my Hot Rod Deluxe. And the reason I like that is because I'd say most of my tone is coming really from the amp there in this situation because I play a lot of jazz gigs, but I also play a lot of funk, R&B, pop type gigs. And I want to just use one amp for all of that. It's like I know how to get my tone out of that, just like kind of how I dial it in. But I don't want to have to switch around. Like I've never used any of the very clean, like jazz type amps.
The
Like these small
polytone
little,
stuff.
yeah, like the Polytone, the Henriksen, like those type of ones. There was like a DV Mark one at school when I was there that people would use, and I found it like too dry. Um, yeah, I like the tube sound of the Fender tubes. It's funny because Kreisberg actually, I know Kreisberg decently well. We've had some lessons, and his best friend is actually one of my first guitar teachers. This guy, Dylan from down here in South Florida. Kreisberg hates the Hot Rod Deluxe because there's and I never noticed it until he said it. And I hate him for saying this because now I notice it all the time. There's a kind of rattle in the transformer. And I got my amp guy to fix it. For these Hot Rod Deluxes, where if you're doing like solo guitar or something that's a little bit more subdued, like lower volume, there's like a little like shake in the amp that for someone as precise as Kreisberg really bugs him. So I think he prefers another type of Fender. I don't want to speak for him, but it probably like a twin reverb or something along those lines. I know he doesn't like the Princeton ones. I feel okay with maybe it's a Princeton actually. I feel okay with the Roland, like JC10. Mm-hmm. We had those at my college, the big band. Kreisberg hates those as well. He has good reason for the kind of tone that he's trying to get. It doesn't really work as well. And for these, and also he has a lot more experience, obviously, going through those kind of amps on stage for a bunch of different jazz fests. I think he finds them less reliable. But yeah, for me, it's just guitar into my Hot Rod Deluxe.
All right, guys. So listen to this, guys. Trust me when I tell you, if you haven't heard Chase play yet, he's probably a better guitarist than you. He doesn't have to say it, but I'll say it. He is. Chase, how many guitars do you own?
So let's see. I have my Ibanez. I have a like Mexican Telecaster. That's kind of my backup guitar. Or like when I'm playing more, like for a while I was touring with an indie band and doing more in that style. So I needed something that wasn't necessarily like a jazz box. But those are my two guitars really. I also have a banjo because I did some country tour. And then I have my dad's old like vintage Strat, but it's really still his guitar. And I have a really cheap acoustic Applause. So
Chase,
it's really those three, and it's only really because I need them for gigs. Like I get called for acoustic guitar gigs, and I get called for like rock pop gigs, and then jazz.
Yeah. So Chase was a very talented guitarist. He has a Mexican Tele, not a fancy boutique, handmade pickups wound.
Yeah.
Only on the Blood Moon, just Mexican Tele, and I had the same exact Ibanez Art Core. I forgot. I think when I bought mine, they were like around cheap. $750, $650 around there.
No, this one. So this one, when I bought it, this is like I've had this guitar forever. Like after I had the Fender Squier Strat Pack, that was technically my first guitar. Within about 6 months or a year, I got this one. I think it was $450 at Sam Ash, and then the guy was like, "Hey, for an extra $100, we can make it where it's like quilted, and the pickguard will be the same color. Is that cool? Instead of just like flat red and a black pickguard." Right. And I was like, "Yeah, I guess so." Like I don't know. My dad's paying for it anyways. At that time, like I was like 13 or 14. And so I've had this guitar since then. It cost me about $550 at the time.
There you go. And so for those who don't know, like in terms of the jazz guitar archtop range, the guitar he's using is basically, no offense, it's right above absolute beginner guitar.
Yeah.
And in terms of jazz boxes, a normal, like quote unquote professional, non-vintage, if we're not getting a vintage ES 175 or whatever, and you're going to go to a luthier to get your jazz box made, minimum 5,000. Something around there, 3,000 to 5,000.
It's at least a few.
Yeah. And then from there, it's easily 10, 15, 20, depending on who your luthier is. Mm-hmm. And I wanted you to tell everyone that because sometimes, so on my channel, my first video that popped was a video that had to do with gear. And before that, I literally never, like I knew about gear because I'm a guitarist, but I never focused on it myself. The channel pops with that. I kind of go more in that direction. But up until I started this YouTube channel, I had maybe, 2 or 3 guitars. And even 2 years before that, I had got through most of my guitar life with essentially 2 guitars, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that I love the whole gear thing. It's super fun. And I think a lot of guitar enthusiasts who are not necessarily professionals, quote unquote, enjoy it as well. But it's easy to get lost in this thing where I need the fanciest guitar in order to get a sound. When I had that Ibanez Art Core,
Uh-huh.
the thing that drove me crazy about it, and I hope I don't ruin it for you,
Yeah.
there was this rattle in the body, and I tried tightening down the tuners, and I tried tightening down every screw, and I could not find this rattle that would happen, and it would drive me crazy, and that's why I got rid of
It
it first
happens
time.
here. This is where it happens. It happens with the pick guard and sometimes with the like actual pickup.
Mm,
Sometimes that will rattle. It's like this has a little bit of play right
I
here,
see.
and sometimes it's not explicitly screwed down here. I've had the same exact thing, and it kind of comes and goes depending on how I've adjusted this pick guard.
But you just make do
So
with it. It's not driving you crazy like the amp rattle.
no, it doesn't anymore. Like you just have to adjust it a little bit. Like sometimes it's too tight, sometimes it's too loose, and then it goes away.
I see. Well,
Um,
maybe I'll have to get another
yeah,
one.
my main thing with this, to be honest, I love playing, and I've played really nice guitars. Like when I was at UNF, the Benedetto factory, Bob Benedetto, and all of the I forget the CEO's name, but he came down and he brought down for Barry students and all of us, like I'm telling you, like $20,000, $45,000 Benedetto guitars, like perfectly matched wood, like insane. I like didn't even want to touch them because like I don't have that money if I something happens, if I break a tuning peg or whatever. And they were nice, they were really nice, but I honestly still preferred the Art Core, partly because obviously it's a comfort thing, but a lot of those arch tops are too big.
Mm-hmm.
They just
16
feel like,
inches.
yeah, they feel too massive. And I think this is technically a 3/4 hollow body.
Mm.
Like it's not a full depth and not full on this axis. So it's very easy. It's very comfortable. It's like a little bit smaller, not really short scale, but it feels a little bit smaller. Um, than like when I've played on Kreisberg's Gibson or like other of these like bigger traditional arch tops. And maybe it's just because I'm coming from this, but for that, it feels more comfortable with this, and I feel like I can really dig in a way that the other art shops don't allow me to. And on a gig, a lot of times I don't want to worry about my instrument being stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of guys down here, I mean, all over, they get their instrument stolen because they have a super nice one that goes for thousands of dollars. And now mine kind of looks like it's thousands of dollars, but I wouldn't, there's sentimental value to that guitar, but if I have to buy another one, it's not a huge deal instead of like being $5,000 that I have to come up with. So just because of the amount I gig and doing all that, I never want to have to worry about or have that kind of stress of replacing a guitar I would just leave it. Like I'd never bring it out to a gig.
Right.
And then to me, what's the point? Like this is road worn. It's got nicks, it's got all that. And to me, that's the point of the guitar, is to play it. But I don't want to have to worry about it getting lost and having to replace something like that.
Absolutely. And the other thing about the traditional like 16-inch arch top that has the floating pickup, a lot
Mm.
of times those guitars do sound more acoustic. Like if you're going to mic the actual guitar,
Yes.
10 times out of 10, it's going to sound better than a guitar that has the pickups mounted in it where the wood's been cut out of the top and all of that stuff. But if you're going through an amp anyway, and you're not miking the
Mm-hmm.
actual F hole of the guitar, then,
Yeah.
a lot of times having that big body is going to be harder to control on stage in terms of feedback. It might be a
Yes.
little bit more difficult in terms of its tuning stability because it's a real acoustic instrument, and that's just the name of the game with acoustic instruments.
Yep.
Humidifiers, it's a whole different animal. So
Yeah, especially down here with the humidity, the Florida humidity and um, adjustments. I have to make yearly adjustments not only to my guitar but also to my amp, because the humidity down here is so much that it affects the soldering on the amp. Like within the course of a year, you really should be getting your amp, tube amp at least, resoldered in various areas, getting it checked out.
Wow. I didn't know that, but that's probably because I didn't
Yeah.
really mess with tube amps much, or at
Yeah.
all, I should say. I have another question. Maybe this is the final question for
Uh-huh.
today about gear. And then hopefully maybe we can have you on again. We could talk about some other stuff because this is guitar craft and
Sure.
other stuff. And I know you do BJJ just like I do. I know you
I
follow,
do.
yeah, I know you follow MMA probably as much as I do.
Yeah.
So that could be some other fun conversations in the future. I've found in my personal development, the second I started to acquire more guitars, I noticed that I was getting less. And I don't know if this has happened to you, but maybe you have a thought
Mhm.
on this. So I noticed
Okay.
that, I'm playing, a Parker guitar, let's say, and then the next day I pick up a PRS guitar. I noticed that when I'm practicing, if I have an hour to practice, since I'm playing a different guitar, it's taking me maybe 5, 10 minutes to get my technique locked into place.
Hmm.
And, we don't always have 3, 4 hours a day to practice. In fact, we usually don't anymore, right? Because it's
Yeah.
teaching and gigging, all of that stuff. So it's like, I have personally found that having just one guitar that I rely on helps to make sure that when I sit down to practice, I'm actually getting something done. Because I can't say, well, I'm not feeling this guitar today. I'll pick up a different one. I
Hmm.
can't blame the guitar and try to set it up differently. It's like, no, this is the thing that I have. And now that I have this 30 minutes, I can either practice with it or I can just do nothing. You know what I mean? Have you experienced anything like that as well with your guitar stuff?
Yeah, I notice it when I'm going from my Ibanez to my Mexican Telecaster. I think the Telecaster that I have is like a modern C-neck. I think that's what it is. And it feels pretty different from my Ibanez. And so when I'm doing, also the action on it's different because I have it set up for more of like a rock blues and the strings are different. Like all of that. I do find myself going from that one to the other where I feel like, oh, like my licks aren't coming out as natural, and it will take me some time to get used to the difference in action and neck feel. But I haven't been playing the Telecaster that much recently, and I like just being able to grab my same guitar, and it always, like, it lets me tell when it's always my hand and the amount I've been practicing. Like if I feel off, it's 100. Like it's very clearly, yeah, I just haven't been practicing as much as I had before, and now I feel comfortable or I don't. And there's a huge difference when you've been practicing for a consistent amount. Your hand is just like on, like things are just flowing versus when they're not. And if you have never practiced consistently, you don't get to that feeling. But then it's good when you stay on the same guitar, you can just maintain that by continuing to practice. So I don't
Absolutely.
really run into it because I stay in that same guitar, but I do notice when I'm switching guitars that certain things, it's certain technique things. Like this guitar is not set up as much to facilitate bends and as much as my Telecaster is, and certain jazz type of phrases just feel a little bit off on the Telecaster. Just how I have it set up.
Yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah, I could see that the main benefit that I would see of having multiple guitars would really come on the songwriting side, where you want to, if you really want like to craft a song that's in a certain genre, it definitely would help to have a guitar that gets you already as close as possible to that. Like if I'm writing a country lick on a Telecaster, it's going to feel more natural than trying to do that on my Ibanez hollow body, or vice versa if it's a jazz type of thing. So to me, that makes sense, and maybe some guys are looking for that kind of difference in inspiration, like when they're doing that. I find that most of the time, like we'd already discussed, it's kind of escapism. Like they're trying to get a benefit out of buying the new guitar, to not have to work for that benefit from practicing.
yeah,
Usually,
yeah. Um, or it's just that I need to have, not me personally, but I need to have
Mhm.
10 strats because each pickup is just slightly, well, yeah, of course, it's slightly different, but
I mean, if you have
is
the
it that
means
different?
and yeah, if you have the means and like, some of my students are in the medical profession and they have the means to buy a bunch of different nice guitars, like awesome. Like I'd love to have the George Benson, Ibanez or different Japanese model or whatever. but I just recognize, and I try to get them to recognize, you don't need it to actually perform better. If you accept that you're buying this because you love it and you just want to look at that instrument and feel inspired by playing that, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you tried that George Benson Ibanez?
I haven't. I've only looked at it.
It is. So I actually picked one up maybe 2 weeks ago. I was passing by Sam Ash
Okay.
on 34th Street, and they actually had one, and it wasn't that expensive. I think it was less than $1,000. I'm pretty sure, or right around
Oh,
$1,000.
wow.
So maybe there's like a less expensive version and then the more expensive Japanese model, whatever. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But the one thing that I think is really cool about that guitar is that so for those who
You're about
don't
to convince me to buy one.
for those who don't know about jazz guitars, very quickly, there are two major categories and a lot of subcategories, but you have jazz guitars
Yeah.
that have the pickups that are mounted in the actual top of the guitar, meaning they drilled a hole out and put a pickup there. Sometimes they have just a neck pickup. Sometimes they have a neck and a bridge pickup. And then you have a different category of jazz guitars that have a top that does not have anything drilled inside of it. It's more of an acoustic instrument. And then you have what is called a floating pickup, usually attached to the neck, but it's not drilled into the body of the guitar. And so
That's like the real purist.
exactly. And of course, Chase knows this, but for the listeners, the cool thing about the George Benson model is that it's the only production guitar that I know of. I could be wrong. The only production guitar that I know of that has a top that is not drilled into whatsoever, but it has two floating pickups. So it has a floating pickup in the neck and in the bridge, and it has all of the full acoustic properties of an acoustic guitar, and it has a slightly smaller body. So my guess, even though I've never owned it, but my guess would be is that that smaller body is going to make it less susceptible to dealing with the feedback issues of an acoustic instrument. And yet you still get that whole neck and bridge pickup dynamic. And, most jazz guitarists don't use the bridge pickup, but it's there. And it's a pretty cool sound when I plugged it in. And so, I was actually thinking about getting one to review because it's very, very, it's smaller than even your Ibanez. So it's very compact. It sounds decently good acoustically, and it does have both pickups, and they are both floating. So plus it's George Benson, and it just feels good pretending that, I deserve to hold a George Benson guitar.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, maybe if we can get one, we can convince you to get one or something too down the line, since you're like going to be the resident jazz expert.
That's my whole goal with my YouTube channel. Just get big enough that Ibanez will send me these George Benson model guitars, and then I'll be set. I'll be set with that.
Yeah. So we're going to conclude for today. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about your new site that you just launched in terms of your jazz? You mentioned it a little bit more, but maybe a little bit more detail for the listeners who are interested in studying with you in the future.
Yeah, so actually I have two different guitar communities. One of them is a totally free guitar community, which guys can check out. Honestly, the easiest way is if you go to YouTube and find my YouTube channel, Chase Maddox. In the description, there's links to the free guitar community. And so from that, you would also see what I have as the paid community. But the free community has access to all of my free YouTube PDFs, the PDFs that relate to the YouTube lessons. And then that kind of gets you an idea of what my paid community is like. The paid community is my course curriculum, this course that I've been developing. It's ongoing, but with live coaching from me. So that's one of the big differences is I'm actually there teaching class to these guys live, which I think is important because you get basically the benefits of that private teacher, of a live teacher, while also having that curriculum. And then the importance of the community is that each of the lessons has certain action items for you to record yourself and then post videos in the community. And then I give feedback on what you're doing, suggestions to improve, and other members do as well, giving encouragement and other things that they notice. So overall, like you get these guys are getting a lot of support and encouragement and that immediate feedback. If you post a video today, guys will post a video from whatever lesson today, then I immediately see that and give them feedback. So you don't have to wait a week for improvement from a private teacher. And we have other things as well. Like I bring in a bunch of jazz guitar masters. Like we had Dan Wilson a few months ago to do a master class with the community. We have a social hour coming up on Saturday, like just to hang out and chat. I have different office hours, different mini courses in addition. So like this month, we did a whole practice master class so that, you know, it's the new year, getting everyone started on getting their practice together.
Absolutely. That's
So,
awesome.
yeah, the
And
best way, honestly, is like I said, joining the free community and then seeing from there. The membership to my paid community is about to close anyways. So I have limited members so I can just like onboard them and get to know them. And then in a couple months, we'll probably reopen. But
you'll have a waiting list for those who want to try in the future.
exactly.
Yeah. As you all know, I'm not, I've studied jazz. I use jazz theory in all of my playing heavily, like very, very, very heavily. But I'm not a jazz guitarist. I don't teach jazz guitar. And as far as the things that I've seen for jazz guitar education, I've mentioned a few already. But Chase's approach here of having these group master classes and having the communal support is another big thing. Sometimes, well, a lot of times when you're studying something as advanced as jazz, it's easy to quit. And if you have someone who you have to be accountable to, like someone in your class who you're friends with, all of a sudden it's like, well, if I quit, Chase is going to know I'm going to look kind of stupid. And then you show up the next day and you do a lot better. And you're like, actually, I'm glad I didn't quit. So I highly encourage his work if you're interested in learning jazz guitar. And yeah, I think it's amazing that you have that set up on your site for everybody. So thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Thank you for being our first virtual guest. And hopefully in the future, we can talk about some other stuff as well and have you back on when you're ready to talk more about some other site stuff and all of that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andres. It was a fun conversation and I'm glad we got to do it, and honored to be your first virtual guest.